This is the Keys to the Kingdom podcast, where we explore how the psychedelic renaissance becomes accessible to everyone. I'm your host, Tammy Sanders, and I'm glad you're with us. Thanks so much for listening. In this episode, David Carpenter joins us to discuss writing about psychedelics for Forbes Online and delivering the first book in his series, Your Neighbors Are Doing Psychedelics. If you live next door to David or me, well, now you know. David's keys are storytelling, rethinking bias, and psychedelics advocacy. After 7 years of writing about cannabis and inspired by positive personal experience with psychedelics, David began reporting on psychedelics for Forbes 2 years ago. He's covered trends and breakthroughs across a variety of substances, including MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine, ayahuasca, iboga, and 5-MeO-DMT. The first book in his Neighbors series features ex-policeman Nick Watchhorn, who lived through a horrific mass shooting and participated in groundbreaking clinical MDMA trials in search of inner peace. David's next book will focus on 5-MeO-DMT, both toad-derived and synthetic. Along with his keys, David and I discuss coming out as a psychedelics user, the big problem with so-called tiny traumas, and the upside of changing one's mind. David, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. It's really great to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Um, we're both fellow reporters. My life as a reporter was quite some time ago, but I think I've certainly been drawn to your work, looking at psychedelics through a journalist's eye. So it's been really intriguing for me to read your articles, read your book, because there's a way in which you talk as a journalist, I think, that makes this really accessible. And this conversation is all about access. So I do think there's a way that we talk about psychedelics that sometimes can be a little bit inaccessible for folks, and maybe can be too academic, or maybe for some, as one of my friends like to say, it's too hippy dippy. But I think that there's a way that you talk about it that can make psychedelics a little bit more accessible. Is that something that you think about, or what are your thoughts about that?
Well, thank you. I'm glad you feel that way. It is something I think about quite a bit when I'm writing these stories. I think that anytime you step into a topic like psychedelics, it's important to be objective. And I feel like, though I'm clearly pro psychedelics, particularly for trauma, I try to kind of walk somewhere in the middle so that I'm neither a zealot or a prude. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. So the voice that I use, I really have honed it over time, where I think about this demographic on this side and the demographic on this side, and I really try to temper it at times. Right down to like words that I'll use. I'll think, no, that's going to set a person off over here. It's going to put me into this category. So I do think about that quite a bit.
Yeah, I remember in our setup, in our intro call, in our setup for this conversation, you talked about how long it took you to find the title. Can you speak to that a little bit, and sort of what that
Yeah,
process was, and why did it take you so long?
yeah. So I really wanted something that was accessible to people, something that would be thought provoking, while at the same time kind of provocative. And Your Neighbors Are Doing Psychedelics is obviously really provocative. I mean, it's almost poking a stick at people who are on the side that are like, no way, psychedelics cannot be good for people.
Mm.
So I had to I went through hundreds of different titles, and I was thinking the word neighbors has to be in there. Your neighbors, typically, if in the best scenario, your neighbors are people that you want to be around, that you trust, that you look to if you're in trouble, borrow a cup of sugar kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, I mean,
so
obviously not during the not during COVID times, but I get your
Right.
point, right? I get your
It's
point.
true. During COVID, everybody's shut in and isolated. Yeah, but in the best of times, you hope to reach out to your neighbors for assistance. And if you're in trouble or traumatized, it's a neighbor, and not just in the sense of the person that lives right next door or across the street, but like you and I, Tammy. I
Hmm.
feel a neighbor, like,
Hmm.
kind of feeling for my friends and people that I've just met, like yourself. So I knew the word neighbors needed to be in there. I was, so on the word psychedelics, and I'm sure
Hmm.
we'll talk more about this later, what exactly what constitutes a psychedelic.
Yeah.
But I landed on your neighbors are doing psychedelics because it felt to me inclusive. It felt to me like I was helping to remove the stigma of psychedelics and getting out there, coming out of the closet, so to speak, of
Mm-hmm.
like, I am not ashamed and you shouldn't be ashamed. And so that's
Yeah.
how I came to the title.
It's interesting that mention of coming out of the closet. As a gay woman, I know that experience actually quite well, and that's usually how I've talked about, or have in the circles that I've been in my life, we've talked about coming out of the closet. It has been around being gay, but it's interesting now because I do also feel that around psychedelics, where I feel myself having this second coming out around psychedelics, and up until very recently for me, it's been a very private endeavor. It's been an endeavor that was about healing, endeavor that was about development and expansion. It's been very, very private. And now I'm getting to a place where I'm starting to be more public about that. I wonder if you've had that sort of private, public transition yourself. It's okay if you haven't, but I'm just curious. I realize we haven't talked about that. Did you
Yeah,
find yourself having a public private transition as well?
I absolutely did. Yeah, I kind of first and foremost, with family, which I'm sure is the case, for a gay person coming out. That has to be, you've lived with these people all your life, and now whether they suspected it or not, now it's right in their face, right?
Mhm.
So with psychedelics, I did have that kind of coming out, specifically to my mom, who's 81 years old.
Mhm.
There was, first it was lightly with these kind of hints about it. I'm writing this book, before that, writing for Forbes. So it took some time for me to boldly just say, yes, I've had experience with these things. Not only do I write about them, but I have enjoyed them myself. They've helped me and helped me in my life, and to, friends of friends who may not be of the same mind that I am with psychedelics. Um, they've asked, so, have you tried some of these? I mean, and before I would kind of stammer a little bit, and I would be like, well, way back when in college.
Way back when in
But
college. That's a
yeah,
lot of people get away with a lot of stuff talking way back when in college.
yeah,
If that's not a politician statement, I don't know what is,
I
because
know.
everybody's always doing everything way back when in college, right?
Exactly. That's not me anymore, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
My foolish younger years.
Right, right. And I have to say, connected to that is, I did this when I was younger experimentally. And in some cases, it scared me. In some cases, it really woke me up and enlightened me in ways. But it wasn't until later in life, in kind of my middle years now, that I really started to appreciate it and go, oh, this is kind of a tool
Mhm.
that can really expand my life and be used as kind of like part of the medicinal toolbox. If
Mhm.
you have hay fever, you take this. If you're predisposed to depression, antidepressants might work for you. The exact same kind of reverence. And yeah, can't think of the word, but something that's gone through kind of trials and has been tested. I feel that way now about psychedelics.
Yeah, there's a confidence that you can have about it, right? There's a
Yeah,
confidence and belief you can have about it. Yeah.
right, because it works.
Yeah. Yeah, I just kind of connecting to something you just said there. I was thinking about myself as a teenager. And I remember I was a teenager working at a video store and working with other teenagers. I don't know why anyone puts teenagers in charge of their business, by the way. I just think that that's a really insane thing to do as a small
Cheap
business
labor.
owner.
I
But
know.
as a
Yeah.
small business owner, you are rolling the dice, man. That's all I'm saying.
Right.
But anyway, so I remember being a teenager working with a bunch of other teenagers, and one of my coworkers at the time came in and told me about this weekend that she had, and she had dropped acid over the weekend, and she'd had like this really trippy thing. And I remember thinking at the time, that is lunacy. Like, I will never do anything like that. I will
Yeah.
never do anything like that. That's just crazy. It's interesting. When I came out as a gay person, I realized how homophobic I was. And when I started to engage psychedelics for my own healing and development, I realized all the preconceptions I had about them. And I had to do a lot of research and a lot of thinking, um, and a lot of analysis and a lot of data gathering to have that confidence. Right. And I think probably of the, I've worked now across 5 medicines, and I would say probably LSD was the one that was really, I had to do a lot of work to get myself ready for that one, because I had a lot of
Mm,
preconceptions
sure.
about that. So yeah, it's interesting just thinking about sort of how we move ourselves from bias to belief to confidence around these substances.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it's a similar kind of track that I've taken. Um, and that's where I think shame kind of comes into it,
Mm,
because as you start to see the usefulness of these tools, there's still that kind of the remnant,
mm.
right? From, for me,
Oh,
the war on
yeah.
drugs,
Yeah,
in the
I
80s.
hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought about that. Like, sort of the remnant of bias is shame.
Yeah. Yeah. I grew up a Catholic, so there's always that little barking Catholic dog over here,
Yeah.
and I have struggled with that. Something interesting that I came across recently was a really good book by Dr. Carl Hart. Do you know who he is?
I have been trying to get Dr. Hart's attention, but he's a very well known
Yeah,
guy by this point in these circles. He
he
just
is.
published his book Drug Use for Grown-ups.
Yep,
He had published another book before then. He's been actually talking about this subject of legalizing, decriminalizing and legalizing drugs for personal use and personal development. He's been talking
yep,
about this for a long time. I'll actually post a link in the resources of this podcast to a 2014 talk he did with Joe Rogan. He did an appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast where he's talking about this. So yes, very familiar with Carl
yeah.
Hart, learning a lot from him.
He's an amazing guy. So his history,
Hmm.
growing up in Miami,
Hmm.
war on drugs kind of
Hmm.
era, through the 80s. And he had these preconceived notions about, seeing people using, crack cocaine, heroin, whatever. So I really, that book really hit like the right pitch for me, particularly because I'm right in the midst of interviewing people for all different types of substances.
Yeah.
And this kind of ties into the use of the word psychedelics. So in his book, I mean, he's of the mind that freedom of choice to use drugs, as long as you're not harming anyone else. His definition, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but his definition of addiction is a lot different from most people's idea of addiction. If you're able to live a life that is positive and you're moving forward, um, drug use isn't getting in the way of being productive, then you probably aren't addicted.
I'll clarify that for folks who are
Yeah,
listening who don't know Carl Hart's work yet. Um, so one of the things I've heard him say very, very explicitly is you should not be criminalized for what you put in your body.
yeah,
And use is not synonymous with addiction. That it's
right,
important to understand whether the use is productive in your life or whether the use is leading to a lot of adverse consequences in your life. And so,
right,
he does sort of make a very clarifying distinction between use and addiction. And between when he's talking about personal liberty, he's not necessarily talking about, I have the right to do anything I want, anytime I want, any way I want. It's more about if I am putting something in my body and that is not causing a detrimental effect to my life, then I should have the right to do that. That actually is part of my pursuit of happiness, which is enshrined in the Constitution as one of my fundamental liberties in the country.
Right. Yeah. And that really resonates with me. And specifically, the definition or kind of the connotation of certain drugs like methamphetamine is thought to be, this horrible drug that's ravaging the world, really. But crystal meth use, that it's strictly people whose teeth are falling out and who are robbing their grandparents, right? There's been a stigma with that drug, as well as with heroin, as well as with cannabis, which is now cannabis is becoming legal all over the world. So I've sort of changed or developed my definition of drugs that I am willing, wanting to probably include in this book series. In fact, I had thought of crystal meth as something you must be addicted if you're doing crystal meth. That's not true.
Mm-hmm.
That methamphetamine exists within MDMA.
Yeah.
It's
When I
the
tell
MA. And
yeah, that's the MA and MDMA, right?
in
When I tell people what people ask, well, what is MDMA? And I, bring it up and I read the complicated name, and the last thing that everyone hears is amphetamine. Nobody hears like
yeah,
anything before I say the word
right.
amphetamine. They're like, "Are you on meth?" Like that's
Right. So I'm just towards the end of his book, and he's describing how, particularly, and I mean, I don't mean to make it like a black white thing,
Mhm.
but he's talking about white writers in the media who
Mhm.
are just people in the media who are getting behind psychedelics
Mhm.
lately, right, in the last 10 years or so. And it's like, well, my use of LSD and all the kind of classic psychedelics um, is this kind of shining example of potential medical use, whereas heroin and cannabis still over there in
Mhm.
an area that's like not so good, and
Yeah,
and that
there's good drugs and bad drugs.
right.
There are drugs you can admit to doing and people will be curious, but not condemn you. There's drugs that you admit to doing and you get a lot of condemnation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's opened my eyes. That book has really opened my eyes, and they were already mostly open, but it's really made me think like, okay, I have to change my ideas around what I'm going to cover moving forward. A great example is ketamine.
Mm,
That 5 years ago was Special K, people falling into a K hole, right? Like
mhm,
all negative press.
mhm,
And now it's potential, helping people with trauma and depression. It's always been used as an anesthetic. I think it was used as far back as the Vietnam War. It's incredibly safe. So, that one now went over from this bad category of these evil drugs into a good category that's now being used in clinics. So
yeah.
it's really interesting how the media, how I portray to people these drugs, and
Yeah,
I'm
because
developing.
you are the media, actually.
I'm the media.
Yeah, you're the
Yeah,
media. Yeah.
I'm the media. And I'm just some guy sitting in Sonoma who writes these stories that I find interesting, that are like human interest stories that I really get behind, the people that are trying to positively affect their own lives. And I write these stories and I think, oh, a few thousand people will read them, but in reality, I may be reaching 10 people who are in a position in small counties to say, hey, that decriminalization thing that just popped up here,
Mhm.
let's really consider that.
Yeah, we
So
should be thinking about that. Yeah.
we should be thinking about that. So I'm developing my mind on this, and I have to say thanks to Dr. Carl Hart if he's if he's listening to this, or
Yeah.
if I ever talk to him, I'm going to tell him that he helped kind of push me a little bit to develop myself as a member of the media, to talk more responsibly and more equally, I guess you'd say, about all of these drugs that could be, you know, wonderful drugs of healing.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And also, if you talk to Dr. Carl Hart, please tell him to DM me on Twitter because
I will.
I've been trying to reach him.
I'll do that.
And I think because Joe Rogan said this when he talked to when he had Carl Hart on the show the first time, um, that it his work has helped me step back and think about my own bias and my own ignorance. And I've come to actually understand substances, which is what I refer to them now, um, as the same as money. Money itself is neither good nor bad. It's what you do with money. These substances themselves, many of them, are neither good nor bad. It's what we
Yeah.
choose to do with them that determines, whether they're productive or detrimental to our lives. So I do. It is interesting just to have my thinking evolved on this. As Obama once said about gay marriage, his thinking evolved. I certainly have had my own thinking evolve about substances, and I think
Yeah.
psychedelic use has definitely gotten me there. I'm actually,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Did you want to say something? Because I have another thing I'd like to ask you, but did you want to add to this?
Yeah. I did just want to add to that the evolution of a person's viewpoint is a beautiful thing,
Hmm.
right? You shouldn't it shouldn't be that a person's hand gets slapped because they change their mind about something, as long as they're not waffling back and forth. I mean, you and I have said we changed our minds about our own use, with
Yeah.
these preconceived ideas. So I feel like going through my evolution of changing my mind about cannabis and about all of these substances, it gives me a window into how to speak to people who are in the process of maybe that early evolution of changing their minds. I think it's a beautiful thing to kind of illuminate for people the usefulness of these substances. And by the way, I have started using substance as opposed to drugs just because of the weight that we give drugs,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that evolution, I think, is a positive thing.
Yeah, my wife actually helped me with thinking about my language. She said one day, "What's the difference between a medicine and a drug?" And I was like, "Oh, that's a great question." That because it really that gets at the underlying bias that is manifest by our language, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
I was going to get to this a little bit later, but I think this is a good time to talk about this now, because you mentioned, you waffled about, speaking of waffling, you waffled a little bit about whether you were going to include psychedelics in your title, right?
Yeah.
Because psychedelics is to some, it has baggage.
It
There's no
does.
denying that it comes with baggage. I've heard people, and I also, when I talk personally about this, I refer to having engaged in entheogens, but a lot of people don't know what entheogens are. And so then I
Right.
would have to do a whole sort of, educational spiel about entheogens and have people go on
Yeah.
Wikipedia, right? So that there'd be a sort of a lift there. So, how did you decide finally that it would be psychedelics versus anything else?
Yeah. So I thought about the the greatest audience that I could reach with my book. And I feel that that is the mainstream audience. Those people that sit somewhere not too far from the middle.
Hmm.
So obviously the people that are really behind psychedelics, I have them from the start. The people that are this way towards, they might not be so great for you. I want to speak to those people in a way that doesn't turn them off.
Hmm.
And I know that if you throw too many terms at people that sound either too scientific or too kind of woo-woo, which entheogen for me does step into that category, as well as empathogen,
Hmm.
entactogen, which is what MDMA, it tends to go back and forth from being called.
Hmm.
So I wanted to keep it simple. And that's not to say dumb it down. I wanted it to be um, kind of well, very accessible for people, but I didn't want them to get bogged down in the language.
Yeah.
And psychedelics, I go back to, I think it's the 1940s. The word means mind manifesting.
Hmm.
And that to me is the simplest way to describe psychedelics and to describe a lot of these substances that we're talking about today in a really simple way. It's your internal self manifesting from your past and your present and what you could be in the future.
Hmm.
It's like prayer. Prayer is mind manifesting.
Yeah.
Um, very, very similar.
Yeah. Very interesting. Psychedelics, understanding psychedelics as meaning mind manifesting. I think that's a pretty straightforward way to be able to talk about this. I really appreciate
Yeah,
that. I really
sure.
appreciate that. So, one of the things we haven't done yet, David, is we haven't had you situate yourself professionally or personally, sort of tell us, how you came to psychedelics. I think I told you I did this unscientific poll of 5 people asking them what they knew about Forbes magazine, and everybody said, "Oh, that's a money magazine." And so,
Yeah.
how do we get this guy from a money magazine talking about psychedelics and caring about psychedelics? So, how did you come to this?
Yeah, so it initially started with writing that I was doing for Forbes about cannabis. And as most people will know, starting maybe 7, 8 years ago with Denver, sorry, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, California, all slowly coming on as being legal cannabis states for recreational cannabis sales. Um, that caught the eye of Forbes editors. They
Okay.
knew that there was money to be made there. There was a captive audience in the people that already use cannabis, who would read the stories, people that were potentially interested in the financial sector around cannabis, and then the people who were maybe adamantly opposed to cannabis, but weren't adamantly opposed to profits.
No, no, nobody in America is adamantly opposed to making money.
No.
Okay, maybe that's an overstatement, but I would say many in America, you would say
Yes,
they are not adamantly opposed to making money.
they're not opposed. Yeah. So that was a
They may
really
be suspicious or cautious,
yeah,
but they're not opposed. Yeah.
they're not opposed. Yeah. So that, that was a really that was a big audience that was a potential capture for Forbes.
Mm.
Very soon after the first few stories that I wrote about cannabis, I saw the numbers jumping. And it may have been the way that I portrayed some of the people, the entrepreneurs and investors in the space, as regular people. I didn't use any of the jargon that is stereotypical of people that use cannabis. I tended to focus on, because Forbes loves to see the dollar signs, they love to see politician names pop in there. Big time investors, they love to see those names. So I always filled my stories with those little touch points. After about a year, my editors stopped really giving me any kind of input on my stories, and very few of them required any kind of editing, which, as you know, being part of the media, editing is a big part of our job.
Yeah. Yeah.
We
Yeah.
have editors.
The fact that people just stopped editing you, that's
Yeah.
remarkable. I mean,
It,
I had a job in newspapers at one point. That's all I did every day was come in and edit people's writing.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that kind of gave me an edge. I'm a pretty good editor. I might be a better editor than I am a writer. I just have done it for so many years. So my stories were
I actually feel the same about myself as well.
You do? Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
do. I
It's
do. Yeah.
it's mechanical and
Yeah.
mathematic.
Yeah.
It's so that was sort of my first year. Well, when I got into like my second, third year writing for Forbes, I started to see all of these other substances that were potentially coming online to be legal. MDMA, of course, with MAPS and their work through
Can you
clinical
actually
studies.
can you actually say a little bit for folks who might not know what MAPS is?
Yes. So MAPS is an organization, nonprofit that is, let me see if I can get this right, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. That's a
Nice.
mouthful. I got it.
You got it.
Yeah. It is a wonderful organization that I include actually in my first book in the series regarding MDMA. And the fantastic clinical trials that have been going on for decades now with the FDA. They're now in phase 3, which is the final stage of clinical trials to prove that a medicine is safe, that it actually is effective at curing, particularly in this case, traumas, PTSD. so as I started to see um, things like this that were really entering the mainstream and about to just explode on the scene, like we mentioned before, the ketamine clinics that are happening, psilocybin with Johns Hopkins, those great studies that have been going on for depression and anxiety.
Mhm.
I could see a financial component also sitting over there. So I shot out an email one morning, and within like 5 minutes, my editor got back to me, who I had spoken with maybe every 2 or 3 months just to touch base. She said, "Yes,
Do it.
please
Do
do
it.
it,
Yeah.
cover this." So I have since been focusing on psychoactive substances in general and the use for particularly trauma.
Hmm. Okay.
And that's pretty much my arc
Okay.
into this.
And you also mentioned, and I'm not here to out anyone, so you don't have to talk about this to any extensive degree if you're not comfortable. You did mention some personal experience. Even
Yeah,
if you we talk in broad strokes here, can you talk a little bit about the relevance of your personal experience for the work that you do?
I can. Yeah. So, as we talked about, I've had experience, way back in college, and mostly they were positive experiences. At least they were productive.
Mhm.
I love information. You just give me even bad news, and that can be information for me to work with to make it good news.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't mean in a Pollyanna kind of way. I mean, if you tell me what I'm doing wrong, I can change that and make it right.
Hmm.
So coming to psychedelics kind of later in my life again, um, there is a new understanding that I have of them later in life. I think because maybe I'm able to think about them more deeply. And about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, I had an experience with a group of friends that I see on a yearly basis before COVID
Hmm.
actually hit. We would see each other every year, and these are friends that I've known since I was a teenager.
Hmm.
And we meet up. Everybody comes from all over the U.S. One guy comes from Australia, from Hawaii, and it tends to be a festive time. And last year there was the introduction of MDMA,
Hmm.
and I had an experience where uh, I felt a kind of closeness with these guys that I haven't felt for a few years. And it was actually something that was kind of gnawing at me. I was showing up at these yearly things, almost just kind of like, okay, I need to go to this because I go every year.
Yeah, it sounds like habit. It sounds like it's perfunctory, like just a perfunctory
Perfunctory.
habit. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I love to see them, but the last couple of years, it was just I had a disconnected feeling, I guess you
Hmm.
should say.
Hmm.
And I went into this time with them that particular year, feeling like I really want to kind of focus on that and figure out why that is. Um, and it was through one evening where we all did MDMA, where I had this kind of what they call a heart opening moment. And that sounds a little woo woo, but I really, there's no better way to explain it. I kind of stepped out of myself and had this feeling from outside of myself, looking at this incredible meeting of 15 guys that have most of us have known each other since teen years, and how special that is, and how really fortunate I am to have this yearly meetup. And what I was left with was everything's.
Wait, this connection of men, right? Like this is
Yeah,
these are we don't often talk about the importance of men being connected to other men in this way, in this kind of
right.
community. Usually it's, if men are in community, y'all are doing something assertive or
Manly.
aggressive or
Right.
forceful, right?
Yeah,
But
it's true.
you're not just being with each other.
That's right. Yeah, you're lifting weights together, or you're working together or something like that, but not just sitting together and sharing what happened in the last year
It's so
over the course of your
emo.
life.
It's so
Yeah.
emo, Dave. Like it's like these emo guys, man. But like, because I say that facetiously, right? Like this notion that, you all are not supposed to sit with each other and be emotional. There's just something weird about that.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. There is a stigma around that as well.
Mhm.
So and for years, I would the substances started entering around 5 years ago, where there were all these different substances, some helpful, some not, that
Mhm.
appeared at this yearly gathering, and I would think, why are those necessary? Why do we need those?
Mm.
um, Eventually I thought, oh, okay, there are these small tools that help us get rid of all that kind of societal baggage, where we can't just hang out as guys.
Mm.
And as opposed to it being a crutch and something that I thought was unnecessary, it actually was just, it kind of turned the key to get us all to put that baggage behind and just kind of be with each other. And it wasn't like we were, this big pile of guys hugging each other or something like that.
It would be
Sure,
okay if you were, Dave.
it would be okay
You can be a big pile of guys hugging each other if you want. This is
if we,
2021, and if
that's
men
true.
can't be a big pile of guys hugging each other, I don't know what's going on with society.
I 100% agree. And there were a couple of guys that did happen with, and I
You
was
know
one
you
of them.
guys hugged. You know you
Yeah,
guys hugged.
oh, hugs everywhere, hugs everywhere. Particularly one of the guys, but but it was wonderful. I had this kind of opening, a kind of reopening, because when I was younger, we did have that kind of closeness with one
Yeah.
another,
Yeah.
and I have felt that intermittently with some of the guys at different times. But that experience made me go, oh, no wonder this is being studied for trauma,
Yeah.
because traumas are big and small, right? The trauma that I've had in my life, which it's my trauma, so it seems big, right, to me. One of the tiny traumas was the separation from my friends, physically and personally, and it managed to kind of sew me back in with these guys. And the next
I want to.
day, yeah,
Wait.
yeah,
Hold on. I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
sure, no,
All up in your. I'm all up in your story, Dave.
i'm i'm
I.
I'm good with
I
that.
can't. I can't abide you calling separation from these people who matter to you. I can't abide you calling that tiny. I think that we have seen to some degree we've seen America go crazy, like lose its mind because people have been separated
Yeah,
from the people who've been important to them, right? I actually don't think we can I don't think we should underestimate, and I don't think we can overestimate the importance of that connection. It's actually what we're here for. I was taking a walk in these woods that are on my virtual screen here. They're right behind where I live, and I was thinking to myself, trees understand the relevance, the life giving relevance of connection. I think that it would be interesting to be a tree for that because they're all connected to each other underground,
yeah,
right?
right.
And some of them are even commingling, their leaves and branches above ground. Like they really get, like nature gets connection. I don't know why human beings continue to struggle with it so much, but we do, right? So I just needed to jump in there. I'm so sorry. I know this is your story. You need to be able to tell it however you want. But when you said that, this tiny trauma of disconnection, I'm like, that is a significant, like that's it may not be a huge trauma, in terms of I don't know, compared to war or that kind of thing, but I think the trauma of disconnection is a significant trauma.
You're right to jump in and say that. I'm glad you did say that. Um, it's it's no small thing to feel isolation, and
No,
and
exactly.
we
That's exactly how people get depression and
yeah,
anxiety and all kinds of other sort of add on difficulties that come with that.
right. And it often is a downward spiral, right? I mean, isolation begets depression and anxiety, and you isolate yourself more, and you just keep falling down into this hole.
Yeah.
And often it takes a good friend or, a helping hand to kind of pull you out of that. So you're right. I
In
mean,
other words, a connection. It takes
a
a
connection.
connection to
I,
pull you back in.
yeah, exactly. And I I fully agree with you with that. I struggle with that kind of isolation just generally in my life. Being a writer, it's a very solitary profession,
Hmm.
and I live in a beautiful place in Sonoma, California, and I have a beautiful house with my girlfriend, and it's a place that I can really close up and
Hmm.
do my work better than anywhere. But it's also a place where when the door closes, instead of being a wonderful place, sometimes it's like a prison. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah, because
uh,
you're on your own, right?
yeah,
And I think, I think this other thing too, I have had, so I've lived and worked through a lot of pretty intense trauma. Um and I've had people say to me, well, when I think about what I've gone through, it's nothing compared to what you've gone through. So, the sort of add-on effect there, or the add-on sentence there is, so my trauma really doesn't matter, right? Or
mhm,
my trauma is not really that big, or I shouldn't really be thinking
yeah,
about it.
right,
I think on the one hand, it is important to understand that human beings are going through challenges all over the place. All over the world, human beings are going through challenges. And so there's a degree to which all of us can find something to be grateful for when we think about the challenges that others are facing. I also, though, am um, I'm just loath to allow people to minimize what their challenges are. Like, if you are challenged by something, then you are challenged by it.
yeah,
And I think kind of bringing it back to your book, and what you're trying to support here in terms of psychedelics, that you don't have to have come from some like really intensely traumatized background to be struggling, right?
yeah.
If you're struggling, then you're struggling. Like, just embrace that as your reality and leverage it as an opportunity for healing, as opposed to, well, I shouldn't be struggling because I only have this little thing that I was disconnected from my
Right.
friend group.
Yeah, right. But like by comparison to your pain, which is great,
Yeah.
you really, and that's what I have done is looked at, a lot of pain in the world, a lot of pain in people that I know, and I've minimized mine. And
Exactly.
can I talk about the character in my book? Actually, sorry, the
Yeah.
subject of my
Yeah,
book.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I do want to get to that, because the subject of your book, Nick, actually talks about this as well. And he had like
Yes,
seen some pretty horrific stuff. And even he was
yes,
like, so I have to wonder, before we actually dig into that, because
sure.
I definitely want to come to that. But before we
Okay.
dig into that, I do wonder if there is just some sort of human defense mechanism that causes us to minimize whatever it is we've gone through.
Hmm.
I remember, like, even everything that I've gone through. I remember sitting in 12-step group early on in my sort of recovery and development process, and hearing this guy tell this like really horrific story of his childhood. Like, it was like, seriously, it was like the kind of stuff that people make documentaries about. Like, it was
Mm,
really horrific. And I
hmm.
remember saying to myself, well, man, I don't even know what I am having an issue about. Like, look at that guy's childhood,
Yeah,
right? Like, I don't
yeah,
even know, like, I shouldn't even be having any issues here. I should be fine. Um,
right.
I think there's some sort of like human, kind of like weird, warped human defense mechanism where we sort of minimize what we've been through, as a way of getting on with things.
Yeah,
But I think that minimization like gets in the way of healing. And I think that, like, that's why your work is so important, right? That, sort of letting people know, like, it doesn't matter what level of thing you've gone through. If you're having some difficulty, there is healing. Just use it.
yeah.
Yeah, just use it.
I think it's the incredible ability for that humans have to repress
Hmm.
difficult things that have happened in their lives, particularly Americans, maybe other people as well. But it's kind of move forward,
Move forward.
continue to produce,
Yeah. Yeah.
get that's behind you, that's in the rearview mirror.
Hmm.
Make something of your life.
Hmm.
So
Pull
there's this
yourself
kind of.
up. Pull
That's right,
yourself up.
by the bootstraps. It's
Yeah.
like the American way to do that. Yeah. And
Yeah.
what you do is, a friend of mine said this years ago, you pack the cannon. you just keep pushing back all that hurt into the cannon. And where does it explode? On everyone else, right? Like, so my minimizing my issues that I call small, they eventually will become large, and the grenade that explodes will hurt a lot of people, including myself. It will hurt a lot of people. So it's kind of, it's just incumbent upon each person, I think, to look at the things that they're going through in life and unravel them, for those around you as well as yourself, to be happier and to be more connected.
That's exactly right. I could not have said that better. I'm really glad that you said it, that it is incumbent upon all of us to look inward and unravel what we're challenged with. And now we have this opportunity to do so in a way that is supported and really revelatory and evolutionary with psychedelics. We have a way for people to do that. So let's actually come to your book. So one of the things that I imagine, because there's a lot of preconceptions and stereotypes about who does psychedelics. So I imagine a lot of thought went into choosing the subject of your book. I also know, because I was one of the people who harassed you to be in your book. I was like, that you probably had just a plethora of people to choose from. So walk us through your thought process behind how you chose your subject, and how you're choosing your subjects as you think about this going forward.
Okay, yeah. So it's been a long road. I mean, it's been about a year and a half since I started the project. It initially was one book, and I was going to go through a whole bunch of different substances, interview a whole lot of different people, and I did, in the beginning, interview dozens of people on every type of substance you can imagine. And at a certain point, the stories started to kind of meld into one another, and it became a little bit confusing for me. I was talking to someone about a big ayahuasca trip that they had had, and then a mescaline trip, and using psilocybin under clinical settings, and using MDMA, and some people that found cannabis useful, and there were it was a kind of a confused work that I couldn't quite pull together as this cohesive piece. And I thought, how am I going to reach the mainstream speaking about all these different substances all at once, sort of one after another. And I thought, no, I need to start with one substance. And I need to start with one that is scientifically proven to be effective, one that won't scare people a whole lot, one that sounds a lot like current medicine that is out there, whether good or bad, your ideas of whether antidepressants work or whatever, at least they're out there and they're a known quantity. So I landed on MDMA because it's been used for a lot of years by a lot of different types of people. It was actually first invented by Merck, which is
you talk about. I love you talking about the history, giving that sort of history snapshot of the medicine in the book. I think that was really, really useful.
Thank you. I thought that was important, to ground this in clinical research, to ground this in history somewhere, and to ground it in a span of time being used by human beings and experimented with. So when I decided, okay, it's going to be MDMA, largely because of what MAPS is doing. And I saw Rick Doblin speak a bunch of times at a whole lot of different conferences,
and
seminars.
Rick
Doblin is the founder and current, I believe he's now called the president of MAPS.
Okay, gotcha.
So Rick Doblin, who I also speak about in my book, was the first person, something like 35 years ago, to champion the use of MDMA for trauma used in psychotherapeutic settings where a person would have MDMA and also talk with a therapist. When I went looking for people to feature, there were a lot of really interesting stories. I mean, from people that
How
used it
did you
in night.
not pick me? How did you not pick me? I don't even
Sorry.
understand, man.
I know, I didn't know you then.
It's all right. I got you on the podcast, so I'm good.
Yeah. You know, there were just so many people coming out of the woodwork that were
Yeah,
just like, I know someone who had this story, you know, cautionary tales about people
yeah.
that had you know, not such good experiences initially, and then it worked for them later. You know, my girlfriend loves to go out and dance, and she calls it her therapy time to dance.
Mhm,
And this is not with MDMA, just to dance, and she works things out in her mind.
mhm,
Um, Plenty of people have used MDMA in that way,
mhm.
both at the nightclub or out dancing, or just, you know, by themselves or with friends, you know, like in my case with my good friends. But
I wait,
form, yeah,
I
yeah,
will say, because you know, I had three, and I started my work with three MDMA journeys, and I don't know how anybody dances on MDMA. I mean, I think this is something really important to point out, that, you know, there is no universal experience, even
yeah,
though there are very similar, there are generalizable themes across the experiences. There is no sort of universal way that you know, to do these, to have these experiences, right? So, you know,
right.
the fact that some people can get up and dance, that I still don't, I mean, I was not in my body, right? Like, you know, my energy, you know, left and floated above my body. It was, you know,
Yeah,
there was no way for me to like marshal my molecules so that I could go dance. So
interesting.
it is really interesting that, you know, but then I've talked, and I've since talked with other folks who are doing, having MDMA journeys, developmentally, and, you know, like one person I know, like, got in his car and drove home like an hour and a half, you know, and I was like, oh my God, I don't, you know, so it's, I don't think that, like, people, I just want to make sure that people don't sort of get the sense that there's only one way, or there's one predominant way, or if this doesn't happen for you, then you didn't do it right, or something like that. Like,
Right.
these the experience is, very individual, though the
It is.
outcomes can be very similar and generalizable.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point to bring up. I mean, people have different experiences on all of these substances. Um, so as I was trying to find, you know, several people to feature, which is what I had in mind initially, um, I landed on a person that I found through Maps, actually, Rick Doblin, and someone who worked at Maps at the time, put me in touch with Nick Watchhorn.
Hmm.
And to begin with, I his case was one that was so extreme that I thought, I'm not sure that people will be able to relate to this guy. And let me just like tell you quickly what his story was. 22 years ago, Nick Watchhorn was a policeman in Tasmania, Australia, and he was one of the first responders to show up to a mass shooting in Port Arthur, Tasmania.
Yeah.
And for the people of Australia, even now, all these years later, it was in 1996 that happened. It's still a deep wound. It's kind of like a 9/11 event for Australia. And this guy,
Particularly because Australia is not accustomed to mass shootings. The
that's right.
And, you know, sort of, this was actually a striking abnormality for Australia.
That's that's right. Yeah, and any mass shooting is going to be horrific for the people that are involved in it and the community at large. But you're right. For Australia, they hadn't seen anything like that.
Mhm.
So, you know, lots of people died, lots of people were wounded. It was a single gunman,
Mhm.
you know, and we've since seen a lot of that in America, and it's just an awful thing to go through. Well, Nick, for years following that, um, had issues with PTSD,
Mhm.
and he tried to cover it up with alcohol, just, you know, that put it behind you kind of mentality. And when nothing was working for him, including antidepressants, pain medications for back issues, and just kind of chronic pain that was, nagging him for more than 2 decades, he eventually moved to the US and found out about these clinical trials that were happening, and went through the process of seeing if he was eligible for it. Something like 900 people in San Francisco in the Bay Area applied for this, and only 2 people were. You did as well. Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, when by the time I found out about it, I mean, there were just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people applying, and I was like,
Yeah.
I can't. Yeah, there's no way I'm gonna get in. Like that, I just can't. It was like harder to get into MAPS than it is to get into Harvard or Stanford.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so Nick got in, and so that's basically Nick's story. Then he goes through the trials. I meet him 2 years after his trials, and we have a conversation. We're pretty friendly right off the bat, and I ask him, if would you be interested in being in my book? And I explain what the book is. I tell him, you don't have to make a decision right now in this first conversation that we have, but I'd be interested in telling some or all of your story. His response was, you sound like a guy that is trying to do good for people and not just sensationalize this. He had read some of my stories on Forbes before our meeting, and he said, let me send you something when we get off this call, and then we'll talk about this. So I got off the call and I thought, oh, that's encouraging. I can, there will be this guy who went through this major event as one of my people that I'll feature in the book. And then I can find a couple of other people they're more sort of average people. So I checked my email, and he sent me his personal journals that he wrote through the trials. And I was blown away. I mean, I read the first like 10 pages of this really heartfelt, deep internal, sorry.
That's okay.
Just lost my mic. This internal struggle that he has in the midst of the clinical trials. Called him back the next day after I had a moment to digest this, and said that I was very interested in having him in my story. And from there, he sent me a couple more, his other 2 journals that he had written that were also these kind of 15-page masterpieces of like personal kind of unraveling of his life. One of the more striking things about Nick's story was, as he starts to get into his first MDMA session, one of the first things that comes up is him as an 8-year-old child going through this sort of ordinary experience that most of us will recognize. Mm-hmm. And it's just a kind of chiding by his parents and neglect. And Tammy, this is like, perfectly syncs up with what you were saying. Nick would have viewed that, and he did view that, I should say, and most people would view this as one of those tiny traumas, and
not a big deal.
Not a big deal.
He actually even says that. He's like, I had a perfectly fine childhood. I had a good childhood.
Yeah, this was, I'm sitting by the pool shivering at 7 a.m. My dad wants me to be, Mark Spence or whatever. I don't want to be here by the poolside, poor me. And he's having this dialogue with himself while involved in the MDMA clinical trials, and starts to think, where's Port Arthur? Where's the
real trauma?
Where's the real trauma?
What is
where's
this
the
like
big...
little kid who doesn't want to swim? What is that nonsense? Where's the real trauma?
Right.
Yeah.
So very, back to why my book became what it was. I started to realize that Nick is all of us. That neglect, which so many kids feel, is substantial, and it's one of those building blocks that your life is built on. That's the Jenga gets pulled out, and you're from a very early age trying to fill the void that neglect created.
Yeah, it creates this little crack.
little
So,
crack.
and maybe, that's like, how we think about trauma, right? That some traumas create sort of giant holes, and some traumas create little cracks. But what's interesting is whether the crack is little, it only takes a little crack to bring down a whole building,
Yeah,
right? So, and sometimes actually, I think the little cracks are actually the most pernicious, the sort of the most dangerous because they're little. They're so easy to overlook. They're so easy
right,
to minimize. They're so easy to negate. When you have a giant hole, it's like, okay, you clearly had some messed up things happen to you. You need to go to therapy. You need to work your stuff out, right? Because
right.
this giant hole is super obvious. But when things are really little, and then there's like so many little cracks, right? It wasn't, it isn't just one. There are these little cracks all over our psyche,
That's right.
right?
That's right. It's like a hairline fracture
Mm-hmm.
in a bone, and
Yeah.
then another hairline fracture
Mm-hmm.
meets that fracture, and before you know it, it's like glass. A whole windshield in your car breaks.
Exactly. Starting from one little thing.
One tiny thing.
Yeah.
So Nick recognizes that in the first session, and goes through this kind of deep sort of investigation of why that little thing was the first thing he remembers when he's an hour or two into his guided session. And actually, I should preface it by saying it was only guided, his session, in the sense that two therapists were by his side as he's sitting there listening to music, and he has eye shades on,
Mm-hmm.
and that's per the protocol, that the MAPS and FDA protocol. Mostly, Nick was working this out with himself, with his own mind and his own brain, working with the MDMA, and he would just refer to the therapist when he needed, which was pretty infrequent.
Yeah,
um,
and I think that that's actually, for me, that's when MDMA shows up as a medicine as opposed to a recreational substance. I've had
yeah.
people say, "Well, I've done MDMA and like it didn't change my life. Like, how did you
Mhm.
have this experience?" And I think it's sort of the setting the intention that I'm going to, with the aid of the substance, go in and investigate my internal life. I think that's where you really see this transformation of MDMA from just a substance to a medicine. That's what it means for it to be a medicine, because it is really working with you and you can do some work with it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The eye shades, that's not a small part of this. You're
Mm-hmm.
you're not looking out on the world and synthesizing what's
Yeah.
happening out there. You're really turning inward
Yeah.
and relying upon it's called the inner intelligence, is how I see it referred to quite a bit. And there really is a sense that you know what's best for you,
Mm-hmm.
and a kind of recalibration
Mm-hmm.
that can occur when you do that, kind of like meditation, or for my mom, it's prayer.
Yeah.
My mom is using her inner intelligence through prayer to find peace and happiness.
Yeah. Very
and
interesting.
and that's what Nick found. And by the end of the story, um, Nick finds out some things about himself that were so buried way deep there, that were these little traumas, like we spoke about, just the webbing of glass that eventually breaks, and pulls them all apart. And of course, Port Arthur and the mass shooting that he was involved in is there. I mean, it's very present, but by no means is it the whole story, or even really the majority of the story.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's all about the things that he's gone through in his life. And this is a tough Australian cop in his 50s. I mean, he hasn't been a cop for 20 some years, but he's the guy who is your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
He's the person that you see out there at the supermarket, at church. He's the person who's gone through the antidepressant route, gone through traditional psychotherapy. He tried everything, and there was this little glimmer of hope with these MDMA trials. And now, 2.5 years later, he's doing really great. I
Yeah.
mean, I speak with him every couple of months, and he's better for this. But it was a long a long 3 different sessions over like 6 weeks that brought him to this kind of healing. So I knew that while my book is short, it's 70 pages. I knew that Nick's story and the story of the creation of MDMA with Merck and people like Sasha Shulgin, which was the first person who actually worked for Dow Chemical to resynthesize MDMA after it had been sort of thrown up on the shelf for a good 40 or 50 years. Then Rick Doblin coming along and getting behind it as a medicine for psychotherapists, first in the underground, then pushing it through these FDA trials, which has been decades of work that guy's done.
It's a long game.
Long game.
It's a long game, man. It's a long game.
Long game, yeah.
I want to ask you something else about. I want to ask you a couple things.
Sure.
About your subject. So I was particularly curious that you chose someone who wasn't an American, given that you're an American-based writer. Tell us more about that. Like, what impact, if any, did you think it would have on how American readers would absorb and be affected by your book?
Yeah, so I thought about that quite heavily after reading Nick's journals and thinking, okay, this could be the guy. I thought he's not American. He does live in the U.S. I think he's a citizen now, but to read the story, you'd be like, okay, this is an Australian person that you're writing about. And then I thought about my theme and the title and the whole thing about that these are average, just ordinary people, like, and not to be deprecating saying that. These are just the people that we see in the car next to us in traffic. It doesn't matter that he's from Australia. It wouldn't matter if he's from China. It doesn't matter his skin color or his sex. It doesn't matter anything on the outer kind of what he is in that sense. It matters that he's a human being who's struggling with a trauma, who's trying to find peace. Everyone understands that. You could find a person in Papua New Guinea or Maui or Scandinavia or Africa. All of them have these things that they can try to work out in their lives, and some of them are working through in their lives. It's a human story.
Yeah, there are researchers now. There are researchers and psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health researchers who say that actually to be human is to know trauma. That is actually part of the human experience. So it's not a matter of if you have trauma; it's a matter of what trauma do you have and how do you work through it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's really it's the brave people that face it, right?
Well,
That's
sometimes
where
you're also left. Sometimes I don't know. I don't necessarily know if I'd say I'm brave, but I was just left with no choice because it was either like face this or die. Like, which one would you rather?
That's true, but you do have the choice to just die, to just crumble, and to isolate yourself, and to drink yourself to death, or whatever your drug of choice is. So just the act of trying to help yourself, I find really courageous and brave. I mean, I don't want to overstate it, but I feel like people that help themselves, and a perfect example is you kind of telling me, no, a small trauma is a trauma. It for me to recognize that and confront it is everything. It's wanting to be the best human you can be, and I find that to be a fantastic trait. Someone who wants to live a better life and wants to be a better person.
Yeah. I don't want you to get distracted by this, but there's that light that's behind you. And so
yeah.
There's moments where you're talking about courage and this light is flashing behind you. It's almost like this subliminal messaging, right? It's like, be courageous, and a light flashes at you. It's like a little angel or the voice of God or something, like, be courageous, be strong, face your challenges.
Shine on.
Shine on, be bright. All right. So here's something that I'd like to talk to you about. We haven't discussed this yet because this only came about as I've been researching and preparing for our conversation.
Mhm.
And I have my prompt here, so I'm actually going to look at this prompt for a little bit. I want to make sure I get this right. So I read a critique recently that called out Rick Doblin, the founder of Maps,
Mhm.
as saying, if we're trying to so this is a quote from Rick Doblin that this critic pulled out. If we're trying to
Okay.
mainstream psychedelics, what's more mainstream than a veteran or police officer? Among the call outs in the critique about focusing psychedelic treatment on police officers was the critique that cops are often the foot soldiers on the front line in the war on drugs. Now, the cop featured in your book, he's an American. He's Australian. He's not an American. Many American readers, like myself, are probably not going to be as aware of or educated about policing in Australia.
Mhm.
Um, and given Nick's trauma, it's not hard to empathize with him as a good guy. I know for myself, I have police officers, firefighters, war vets among my family and friends. And while the systems that they're in may be problematic, and these systems may be traumatic for humanity, um, this actually drives me to want psychedelics for them even more so, right? Because their humanity is as woefully impacted as anyone else, any of the rest of us in the system.
Sure.
So as I'm just wondering, like, given your depth of engagement with Nick and your engagement with Maps and Rick Doblin, I just wonder what your thoughts are on preferencing psychedelics for cops and vets. Given this kind of critique, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. First of all, I'd love for there to be access across all of humanity. I would love if everyone, if CEOs and the lady at the checkout stand, at the supermarket,
Mhm.
if all people had access to this. Um, I think that first responders are in a position of daily and repetitive, continual trauma that they face. And I think for that reason, um, people tend to have kind of a soft spot for that demographic. And I really think it was a political move on Doblin's part and Map's part to really put a spotlight on those people because, again, and it's the audience that I would love to reach. The mainstream goes, oh, this could help a firefighter, this could help a cop, a nurse, who's on the front line of COVID. um, I think it's important that there are those touch points that people have where they can say, the person that I feel could really use this is getting this medicine. At the same time, I feel like, the homeless population, who better than that population? Neglected people and children come to mind first of all, and I'm not saying give children MDMA, but people who have been neglected as children, refugees,
Mm.
the lives that refugees live all around the world, tens of millions of people that are displaced. I mean, these are people that I'm sure will eventually be talked about by Maps and by Johns Hopkins and NYU and all these organizations that are working with psychedelics as an even greater number of or a type of demographic that could value by using psychedelics and are also people who we sympathize with.
I would also add to that uh, people who are subjected to domestic violence as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah. It's kind of, I've thought about this quite a bit, and it's something to unravel here because people that are subjects of domestic violence, I think everybody knows people who have been, all of us know someone who has been in a situation like that and has faced that kind of like continual repetitive violence, right? It isn't just the time when the police show up or whatever and it was a beating that occurred. It's ongoing.
Mhm.
So I've been waiting for those types of stories to come up. And this is good that we're talking about this, because I haven't featured a person like that yet
Mhm.
in my Forbes discussions. There've been people that have had child sexual abuse.
Yeah.
Like I've gone to that, to a real extreme, where everyone can go, yeah, that person's hurting. But you're right. There are so many people, including what you just said, people that face domestic abuse, that this would absolutely help.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, it's important to be thinking about, some of this critique comes from like, well, what about the people who've been, people in communities and environments who've been subjected to abuses of power, abuses by cops, abuse by cops, for example. So,
Yeah,
people who
yeah,
are also kind of subjected to power abuse as well, I
yeah.
think is important to be thinking about. And I know for me, given the nature of given the nature of the trauma that I had experienced, um, MDMA really helped me tremendously with working through power dynamics and issues of safety
Mm.
that were fundamental now to my well-being, and that had been crippling me for quite some time, and I didn't know it. It was kind of that stuff was at the heart of my PTSD,
Ah,
were power dynamics, the incompetence of adults, and how that endangers people, endangers me.
yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Just interesting to think about that. Just to, I don't, for me personally, I don't deny the importance of ensuring that first responders have access to this kind of healing support. There's a cop I know in particular, who before he became a cop had, one of the sunnier dispositions that I ever encountered. I've known him since we were young, and then he went into child protective services, and he did that work for a long time. So he was in very like walking into very difficult situations, and taking kids out of their homes, um, and I
Oof.
have no doubt that that had a particular effect on his psyche. And then he
Oh
became a
yeah.
cop, and recently, like in the last couple of years, I've heard him talking the way that I used to talk before I started to heal my PTSD. And I've been thinking to myself, I think he has vicarious trauma. Like,
Oh
it's not his trauma, like he's not subjected to this, but he's steeped in this day after
yeah.
day after day. And I think,
Right.
that's really kind of what you bring to the fore with Nick as well. That it's interesting that Nick's, when he starts his work, he goes back to his own crack, his own trauma,
The
uh,
beginning.
but
Yeah.
but he also is subjected to the trauma of others, which is also traumatic.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's something we don't think about, is absorbing other people's pain.
Hmm.
I mean, as human beings, you can't help it, whether you're compassionate, really compassionate, or you consider yourself to be not so compassionate. Sorry, I had something pop up here. Other people's pain matters.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, I think all human beings, we absorb that energy to some extent,
Hmm.
and that has to go somewhere. You
Yes,
know.
exactly. That's a very good point. It has to go somewhere. Yeah, it has to go somewhere. So, one of the things we talked about was, when I was coming to awareness of psychedelics, getting this, compound complex PTSD diagnosis just before I turned 50, deciding there was no way I was going to spend 10 years on a couch sorting this out. I think I
Yeah.
Googled something like PTSD recovery therapy experiment. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew there had to be something out there. And so stumbling across this, it was
Yeah.
incredible to find this as a possibility, but also, it wasn't easy to access. And I had to
Right.
definitely get into the underground. I had to, sort of
Yeah.
get, weasel my way into the underground, to get access to this kind of healing and development.
Yeah.
Someday this becomes common practice, right? But in the meantime, on the one hand, like I feel the need to ensure that folks know about this, and and there's growing awareness. But on the other hand, I also feel this kind of sense of burdensome responsibility to be telling people about this when I know it's not necessarily accessible. So I just I just feel this push and pull of sort of giving people these wisps of hope, but not, necessarily having it easy to actualize on that.
Sure.
I just wonder if you, like if you struggle with that as well, how you deal with that, etc.
Yeah, that's a really, something that wasn't obvious to me when I first started this project.
Hmm.
Living in the Bay Area like I do, access is not really a problem.
Yeah.
You talk
Well,
to a few people, and someone will say, "Oh, I know someone who can help you."
yeah, you're usually only like, 2 to 3 degrees now, but even that two
Yeah,
degree or 3 degrees can be a bit to navigate, but
that
it is
can.
navigable, right? Like
Right.
I'm not in Bakersfield, for example,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Or like Omaha,
Yeah.
or it's
Although who
like
knows,
like
man? Who knows what's going
yeah,
on? Who knows what's
Omaha
going on?
may be totally hip.
Bakersfield may be like, look, we are good, right? But I
Yeah,
mean, but
yeah.
just this notion that it's not, it's just not readily available. So,
Yeah, yeah. So when I first started to realize this was after I wrote the story I did on 5-MeO-DMT
mhm,
derived from toad venom.
mhm,
And of course, toad venom is, it sounds really outrageous. It's from a toad that is in the Sonoran Desert, which is its own geographical southwestern U.S. kind of area that you would find that toad. um, People started emailing me after I wrote that story and saying, where can I find someone who facilitates or guides a person through this experience? I mean, I was getting dozens a week of these emails from people, and I thought, wow, I wrote this story that I know helped people to see that these medicines can be useful in treating depression and anxiety, but I sort of left them hanging on how they
yeah.
could connect with it
Yeah, because
themselves.
what I mean, what are you like? What's your answer to that, dude? Where can I
Yeah.
get some toad venom? You're like, I cannot help
No,
you.
I
Right?
can't help you.
Number one,
Yeah.
it's illegal for me to help you,
Yeah.
so I'm
Right.
definitely not telling you an email, right?
That's right. That's right.
Call
I
me on
and
my burner phone, right? And
Yeah,
like,
exactly. Exactly. It became like that. Yeah. And
yeah.
and one person in particular stands out. It was someone who lived in a red state, kind of conservative, and this person clearly had a conservative upbringing, was trying to do some work on themselves and a loved one. And she said, you're telling me that my neighbors are doing psychedelics. My neighbors aren't. You're not
Maybe
talking
your
about
neighbors are,
maybe your neighbors in
but I don't know, my
crazy
neighbors are
Bay
not.
Area. Yeah,
Yeah.
my neighbors aren't. So
Yeah.
I replied to her with some podcasts and a few other resources to get her on her way,
Mhm.
um, hoping that it would, she'd have the tenacity. You have to have tenacity if you're right now, if you're looking for these substances.
Wait, and I think
um,
wait. I think that
yep.
cannot be emphasized enough. Like you have to have tenacity. And I do
Yeah.
think that this can be the challenge. Like for people who are grappling with depression, one of the last things you have when you're depressed is tenacity,
Is
right?
that get up and go? Right.
Right?
Yeah.
It can be real. So there, to the degree that if you don't have the tenacity, one thing I would recommend is tell someone that this stuff is out there, and then ask them to swift kick you in the backside to push you to go get it, right? Because it can be really hard if you don't already have the drive to go chase this. It can be hard to get this, so you really have to have
Absolutely.
tenacity, or tell a friend and have them help you hold yourself accountable for getting yourself to this healing.
Yeah, that's really important. I mean, having an advocate that can help you get out of this, again, connection with other people, which
That's the key difference between me and you, David. I can see, right? I say go get someone to swift kick you in your backside, and you say have an advocate. So do what David said. Go get yourself an advocate. Or
either
depending on
way,
or
reach
depend
out.
yeah, just reach out and
Yeah.
tell people, hey, I'm hearing about this stuff. I want to do it, but I don't know. And then, if you're locking into people who care for you, hopefully they're gonna help you sort of hold yourself accountable and
Yeah,
help you advocate for yourself, because you have to advocate for yourself right now if you want to do this.
you do. You definitely do. Uh, Also, you should realize that it's a little bit difficult with COVID and the restrictions on travel. But a lot of these substances, which are considered controlled substances in the US, aren't in Canada or the
Mm-hmm.
US,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, or Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And within the US, there are things like ketamine and, MDMA is on its way to becoming legal. So uh, they are making their way into the greater public, but that that's coming from somewhere, which is the underground.
Mm-hmm.
The underground sort of built this now legal movement, and the underground is getting emboldened, which I think is a great thing.
Yeah, I mean, this
Um,
this this actual this very conversation is is an indication of that.
yeah,
I am, um I understand that I am at risk, having conversations and sort of owning that I have engaged in these substances. But I believe I have I'm in enough of a privileged position. I mean, I will say, like, let me be the Supreme Court case about whether or not, these laws restricting access to psychedelics violate my civil liberties, right? I think I'd make a pretty good Supreme
yeah,
Court case around that. But not everyone has that privilege. So I do think that
right.
are some of us who can come out, we I think we do a service by coming out.
Yeah, I do too. I do too. And I feel the same way. I write about this very publicly. Um, so I'm like you. I feel I'm definitely in a position, in kind of privileged position by comparison to a lot of people, to talk about this. And I'm willing to, with anyone who gets in touch with me or emails me. They can find me through Forbes and through my website. I'm willing to, send anyone resources, and that's the starting point, is even knowing that there are valuable resources out there by universities like Johns Hopkins, and plenty of facilitators and guides that know about all that research out there. It's becoming science driven, a lot of this, which I think is making people more comfortable with the idea of psychedelics, as opposed to cannabis slowly becoming legal. Didn't have so much of that science behind it because of all the baggage and because of the federal prohibition that's gone on forever. So psychedelics are different. They're coming by way of clinical studies with all the might of that underground studying. Those were also studies that,
The experience, essentially the experiential data that
yes,
comes from
yeah,
the underground, coupled with the sort of quantitative academic data that's coming from the research.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can certainly attest to you having having the information that is helpful. I actually first found out about you because I was exploring 5-MeO DMT, getting ready for my first journey with that substance. I remember finding you that way. I remember reaching out to you and saying, please put me in your book, please put me in your book. But if you don't put me in your book, can you at least just tell me something about 5-MeO DMT? And I remember asking you, what podcast would you recommend, or what resources would you recommend? And you certainly provided some. So we'll also have some of that here. We'll provide that as part of the show notes
Good.
for you. So I just want to just reiterate, because I think it's so important that, either find the tenacity or find someone who can help you advocate, connect with people who do have this experience and can get you connected to other resources. If you believe
Hmm.
this is a healing route for yourself, don't let go of it until you get the opportunity to try it, right? Don't let go of that notion until you get the opportunity to try it. And
Absolutely.
I really appreciate you being able to sort of help people along that journey. I think this is the last thing, and I know we gotta close out here, but just about everyone I've connected with so far, who comes to the work of psychedelics, they come to that work through some sort of personal experience. And you and I have talked about this, like this notion of getting the Holy Spirit. I refer to it like that often, that you have to share it. And I heard a piece of either a quote or a piece of poetry from the poet Mary Oliver about how to live a good life that I think sums up what happens to you when you engage in psychedelics. You pay attention, you be absorbed, you tell about it. Um, what do you think that's about? Why do we need to tell about it? Why could you just just have your own experience and just keep this to yourself?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it has to do with this discovery of something inside yourself.
Mhm.
Um, and it's this kind of like light that you feel inside of yourself, this lightness and this kind of beaming light. And once you've discovered this, you really can't hide that light. It just sort of comes out of you, you know?
Yeah.
And I worry sometimes about being a zealot about this, but I temper it with my Forbes writing all the time. And
Mhm.
that helps me,
I'm just an
keep it.
objective reporter. I'm
That's
just an
right.
objective reporter. No, you're not. I see through you, man. I
Yeah.
see
You
through
see
you.
through me. Yeah. So I want to share that light. I want to help a person kind of illuminate a part of their life that could be better. Um, and doing it with my writing is an excellent way to kind of spread that light and lightness and happiness.
Well, I definitely appreciating you come and sharing that light here, David. It's been really wonderful to have this conversation with you. Wonderful to have some time with you. Um, any is there anything that you'd like to close out with? It's okay if not. We've talked a lot, but if there's anything else you'd like to close out with, I want to give you the final word.
Yeah, well, I would love people to read my book. Your Neighbors Are Doing Psychedelics, MDMA. It's my first book in the series. I think they'll find something in there that is of it could make them happy and maybe understand their own plight. Um, Also, if you're on the fence about talking about this, I would suggest that you don't have shame over your own use or your own interest in this. It felt really good when I told some people about my own use and how this has helped me with my life. And I know that I've kind of spread that joy to other people who have kind of had experiences since then that have sort of woken them up. So I think just uh, communicate that there should no longer be a stigma around this. There should have never been. And this is just another tool in the toolbox of being a human being and the kind of clinical toolbox. Also, you can go to my website, which is yourneighborsardoingpsychedelics.com. That'll have updates on the next book that I'm working on, which is on 5-MeO DMT. Um, I'll try to put more resources on that page for people to see some good studies that are going on with these substances. And I think that's about it.
Excellent. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to the next one. I believe we'll be having another conversation once that happens.
I
David,
hope
thank
so.
you so much for your contributions, and until we meet again. That wraps up another episode of Keys to the Kingdom. Thanks so much for listening. Check out the show notes for resources we discussed, and follow the Keys conversation on Twitter at Psychedelics Key. Until we meet again, remember, you are connected, you are love, and the kingdom is yours.